For today's World Spotlight, we're going to be looking at Snorlax, the blocking archetype. It's been around for a long time and is still frustrating so many players and is still a high tier threat. So let's get into the general strategy of the archetype, and that's that the block ability of Snorlax is certainly very disruptive, where you can try and trap things in the active position so that they can't retreat. So anything that can't attack, if we can force those into play with certain item cards and supporters we play in the deck list, we can try and leave our own Snorlax in the active position, so then the opponent has that headache of having to move the Pokemon. We're never actually trying to win a prize race with this deck. We are simply trying to not lose the game in order for us to then eventually win the game by running our opponent out of cards, is the idea here, which is why you're seeing not only the Snorlax, but also the frustrating abilities of Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon EX, which can't be damaged by Pokemon that have an ability, as well as Mimikyu, which can't be damaged by Pokemon that are EXs or V Pokemon. So with this combination of Snorlax, Ogerpon, and Mimikyu, we give ourselves actually a really decent spread of matchups in the field, either with having Pokemon that can't be KO'd by certain decks, or by having Snorlax, which can eventually grind out on opponents and run them out of switching cards in their own deck list before they've taken those 6 prizes. The main other Pokemon you'll see here is the Rotom V with that instant charge. It's because we're never attacking in the deck. We are just trying to end our turn by drawing extra cards as we go. This really is a deck with not many actions during each turn. You're trying to cherry pick the best supporter card you can play on each given turn and sort of adjusting your board state based on what basics are in play, accordingly based on what matchup you're up against. But more often than not, we're going to need Rotom in those opening stages to draw us through the deck that little bit more, give us those options so we can be trying to disrupt the opponent as much as possible, either by finding some of our crucial item cards or just by having access to the right supporters when we need them. Let's have a look at the matchup spread for Snorlax then. It's very early days in the Shrouded Fable format, but this is the data from August 1st to August the 11th, the day of recording, and you can see that Snorlax block has some pretty polarized matchups, with lots of matchups being sub 40%, but also lots being 60% plus, which means you really are putting yourself in that roulette wheel of what you come up against at the World Championships if you want to lock into this archetype. There's a lot of good here for Snorlax. You're good into Regidrago, the new up-and-coming archetype, no doubt. You're pretty good against the top performers of Gardevoir and Charizard over the last few formats. You're good into Lost Zone Box. You have a very good Chien-Pao. Raging Bolt is okay, as well as Miraidon, but there are some glaring issues here in that you're most weak into the Lugia matchup and the Pidgeot control, where the Pidgeot just has so much search guaranteed throughout the game that they can make sure they're doing the most powerful things against you, and often play more proactive milling strategies than us, which really just has like Eerie, Xerosix Machinations, and Misfortune Sisters as the main way to discard, whereas oftentimes the Pidgeot control will have Chi-Yu EX in the list, or just more access to their Xerosix Machinations and Eerie's and such throughout the game, where they can use Quick Search to get their Power Pads back, reload the supporters, then immediately access them again, whereas it's a little bit more tricky for us to try and make that happen. And the Lugia, of course, is a really bad matchup as well, where they have all sorts of attacking threats that they can burst onto the scene whenever they need to with Archeops, but also, of course, they have Jet Energy to make it more difficult for us to trap anything. So that's certainly a bad matchup. As of late, you've not been great into the Ancient Box either. That's also a negative matchup. You have seen some Pecharunt EX from this set also making it into some of these builds to respect Snorlax, and I think that's very terrifying for you. But at the same time, they just have lots of Fluttermane and Roaring Moon that are really annoying Pokemon that can, of course, attack and shut down your abilities. So yeah, that's a bit of an issue for you. And Dragapult's also an unfavourable one, quite an interesting one, but because they can be so cute with their damage spread, and the 200 base damage from Dragapult is actually very solid. Obviously, it's getting around Cornerstone Ogerpon naturally by not having an ability as its main attacker, but also you can sprinkle counters onto Mimikyu at times as well, so when they are using their boss's orders, they can set up Mimikyu, which means you have to sort of proactively heal it quite a lot as well, so that can also be a challenge for the deck. So yeah, some very good boast matchups that you are quite good into, but also some very awkward matchups where inherently it's not easy for us to change the deck to have a better time into these situations. Let's start with the skeleton list then. I've mentioned basically every Pokemon already, apart from the Pidgeot V, which is in here for that Vanishing Wings ability, which means we can put it into play and then put it to the bottom of our deck with its ability, so we can't self-deck out. We can just get to the bottom of our deck and know that we can constantly put down Pidgeot and then put it to the bottom of our deck, which is absolutely fantastic for an archetype like this that will allow the game to go long if it has to. And at the same time, if there are some matchups where you've happened to have led something like an Ogerpon and it's the right matchup for it, or a Mimikyu and it's the right matchup for it, or even Snorlax and it's the right matchup where you know you're given lots and lots of time, You may not even put the Rotom V into play at any point, or you may have already had to proactively like penny it up so the opponent can't take those easy prize cards, or if it's been taken off the board early by the opponent using boss's orders and you feel like you can't re-establish that Rotom, you can still get use out of your Forest Seal Stone because you have Pidgeot V. You can Forest Pidgeot and then vanish it back into the deck all in one go. So it's a nice option to have within the list. The bulk of the deck really is supporter cards, very high Arven counts to get our hit point buff tools and other frustrating tools like the handheld fan, which can move energies around as we get hits, whereas Arven can also get us obviously ball search in the opening stages, but also some more disruptive item cards like Counter Catcher, even accompanying Flute can be something you can tutor at times as well. You can see Hisuian Heavy Ball because we have so many one-of Pokemon in the skeleton list that this is a really important card to cherry pick because we have no other access to our prize cards whatsoever. We have Penny for our bit of healing. We have Misfortune Sisters, Eerie, and the new Xerosix Machinations, which can all target the opponent's hand. Eerie, of course, we're picking as we go, and then Xerosic, your opponent gets to choose, but you're still getting rid of potentially a lot of cards, especially if your opponent is sort of draw passing into you, waiting to hit certain targets. You can Xerosix and punish the fact that they're sat on a large hand size. Maybe they were planning to Iono lots of cards to the bottom of their deck. This can really speed up the win condition of the Block Snorlax, which is trying to passively mill the opponent rather than actively discard lots from their deck. This Xerosic actually changes that quite substantially, so you will win faster once you've got the lockdown and you know that your opponent won't have any other answers to whatever's in the active. So the Xerosic certainly does speed up the win condition of this archetype, which I do think is important, especially for worlds where you're not really allowed to afford to tie too much, so making sure you're getting a win under your belt and not just being completely stalled out the game is going to be pretty important for you. The Team Yell's Cheer and the Silene is kind of what allows you to go infinite alongside your Pal Pads, and then we have a boss's orders in here, although most of the time you're looking to use Counter Catcher, the boss can also weave in and is recyclable with Pal Pad, and the Iono can offer us a different means of trying to hand disrupt as well, which I think can be important if you're really on death's door and your opponent could still have some outs to beat you. Sometimes putting the best thing in the active at the time, playing an Iono and hope to dodge for a turn or two while you give yourself more opportunities to use Eerie's and Misfortune Sisters and hit their final cards that can beat you is sometimes important as well. The Erica's Invitation and the accompanying Flute is how we're going to try and force Pokemon into play, so then we can have trapping targets with our Block Snorlax. We have Pokegears, so we can cherry pick some of these low counts of supporters that we have in the deck list, as well as give us extra access to Arven and Penny as well, of course, because it's a very common play that your opponent will try and punch into something not for a KO, but also try and Iono at the same time so that you don't have access to Penny in hand. So having Pokegears gives you more license to have Penny like just within the deck and to be found as and when you need it. The other new inclusion of the deck is the Night Stretcher. In the past, we had just one copy of Super Rod, but having the instant access from Night Stretcher off of an Arven is really handy to recover either just more Snorlax or just that Mimikyu or Cornerstone Ogerpon, which can be 1 or 2 counts within the deck. Bearing in mind, of course, that we don't really mind the fact that we're losing our Super Rod because we already have Team Yell's Cheer in the deck as well, which can also provide some Pokemon recovery when need be. I think probably the biggest debate around Snorlax is whether you commit a lot of spaces of those last 10 cards in the deck list to actually having a decent time into Lugia or going for a 0%. Now, the matchup data online is saying it's around like 35 or so % right now, and there'll be some Snorlaxes which are completely choosing to tank that matchup, and some Snorlaxes giving it a good go and trying to make it a little bit close. And the way you can try and make this close is by having lots of Temple of Sinnoh in the deck list to sort of establish that stadium as the final stadium in the game so that your opponent can't use their Jet Energy to get around block, alongside ideally the Giacomo supporter, which can discard a bunch of special energy from the opponent all in one turn, and even weaving in things like Crushing Hammer can be handy as well, just to sort of run the opponent out. Oftentimes Lugia is playing like 16 energy, sometimes as high as 17. The hope is that with enough of this discard energy, we can at least bring up annoying cards like Archeops, which have much lower damage output. Even if they can attack you every turn of the game, you can eventually, with enough Temple of Sinnoh, Giacomo, and Crushing Hammer, with of course Silene trying to recover these sorts of cards, give ourselves that situation where eventually we stop leaking prize cards and we do find them in a lock. If you're giving a lot of respect to the Lugia matchup, I would also consider the Secret Box as the A-Spec. That's why I didn't have an A-Spec card in the Skeleton 60, because I do think that Secret Box does have its merits if you are very much respecting the Lugia matchup, because this allows you to just have even more access to the Giacomo one-of supporter, which is so integral to find as quickly as possible against the Lugia, and even even just to reload it. If you've already played this card, you can try and use Secret Box plus Pal Pad as a combination to get a second use of Giacomo, and that's where the Secret Box is absolutely insane. Of course, it gives you extra access to Temple of Sinnoh as well, and in other matchups, it's by no means dead. It's just another like guaranteed Pokegear hit on some of your low counts of supporter cards, so it's still a really handy card. We actually saw the Secret Box do very well at the NAIC. I think he got second place in the Seniors division, so yeah, the Secret Box is certainly viable over the Hero's Cape, which is the most common inclusion in Snorlax, and I think if you're very respectful of Lugia, it might even be the right choice. Of course, if we're not committing all this deck space to improving the Lugia matchup, there are other cards that we can certainly consider. Chi-Yu and Fire Energy is sort of out of vogue now that we have the Zerosix Machinations, which can give you sort of active discard. Obviously, it's not the deck that you're removing cards from, but still removing cards from your opponent's hand. Even if they are the kind of like most dead cards, you still are whittling the opponent's deck down in one way or another. And the Chi-Yu, I think, is the most proactive card you can use in a mirror match situation, which kind of would be the big nod here, that without it, you're very poor into Pidgeot, and you wouldn't be good in the mirror at all either. If the opponent is playing Chi-Yu and you're not, you're going to be caught short there more often than not. So yeah, I think the Chi-Yu could be reasonable if you expect a lot of Snorlax going into the World Championships. Like I said, Hero Cape is kind of the go-to ace-spec card just for that 100 hit point buff. It's very hard to ignore. Of course, when we are trying to wall with our Ogerpon and Mimikyu, having just far more hit points is obviously the best thing that we can do here to try and protect it. Mist Energy can also help out in a lot of situations where the Mimikyu and the Cornerstone Ogerpon prevent damage from attacks, but not effects of attacks. So having the combination of Mimikyu or Cornerstone's ability plus the Mist Energy turn attachment, then you're blocking far more things from the opponent. So that could be a really appealing option. And I will talk about some attacking threats which rely on the fact that they're using effects of attacks rather than damage to try and get around you. And then finally, Sandshrew. This one's kind of been in and out of vogue really based on how deck lists are forming. If you're starting to see cards like Pal Pad sneak back into deck lists, it certainly might be useful to deny the opponent their use of Pal Pad, because of course some of the supporter cards are the scariest ones here for us to come up against because we can't proactively discard them with Misfortune Sisters or with Eerie, and it's typically cards like Boss's Orders and Professor Churro's Scenario which can be our undoing if the opponent has enough of these styles of effects to get around our walling Pokemon or strategy. So the first 60 I wanted to look at really just says dodge Lugia and says, well, it's already a really bad matchup, let's not commit any slots to making that better, let's just make our own list that little bit more consistent and better on our own end, and know that Lugia will just be a bad time for us. In this case, we're adding in that second copy of Rotom because it's just so vital to have it as a nest ballable target. Even if you were just to play one Rotom and two Heavy Ball, the fact that it's so much harder to see Hisuian in the opening stages makes it a little bit more risky. So having the physical 2 count of Rotom does seem like the preferred choice here. And it also means that, yeah, again, if the Rotom is KO'd, you can still put a second one down. It would be a huge risk to do it, but if you're in panic stations, you can make it happen. There's also a second copy of Cornerstone Ogerpon here. I'm just at 1 Nightly Stretcher and 2 Cornerstone. Again, you could think about this flip-flop within the deck, but I do think that the Team Yell's Cheer is already a nice backup for Pokemon Recovery anyway. So I think you can get away with playing 2 copies of Cornerstone because it is really important in the Charizard matchup these days, with Mimikyu being far less good of an answer thanks to the Dusknoir coming out and being important in the Charizard matchup, where they will oftentimes use Dusknoir either to physically KO the Mimikyu or to give you so many prize cards that they can attack with Radiant Charizard as well for a more efficient cost. So it really seems like the Cornerstone Ogerpon is going to be the way that you try and beat most Charizard players at the moment. And then really we're just adding in some more consistency cards in the extra Pal Pad, the extra Handheld Fan, the Hero's Cape as the go-to option, Artisan as an extra searching card, and Stadium Bounce. And then we are playing 3 copies of Crushing Hammer. I do think it's important right now. It can be very good against the Regidrago matchup, and with Handheld Fan in the deck list now, between these couple of things, you can actually try and hunt down your opponent's fire energy quite effectively and make it so that these energy end up on annoying Pokemon or just in the discard pile altogether, or simply slowing down their tempo, forcing them to play Professor's Research as their primary supporter card can be a huge headache for them. At the same time, Handheld Fan combines really nicely with Crushing Hammer in all sorts of matchups. It's again very handy against the Gardevoir matchup, the Lugia matchup as well. There's just so many reasons why this combination works so nicely together that I do think it's versatile enough to play a high count of Crushing. However, I am still making the space for that Mist Energy. I think protecting your Mimi and your Ogerpon for even more things is just very viable right now, so I do like that option. And ultimately, at the same time, you have 1 retreat cost on Rotom, Ogerpon, and Mimikyu as well, so with just the 1 count of the switch card in here, having 1 energy never feels like a bad thing, just as a pivot as and when you need it to get into a Snorlax. And then we have the list that is trying to respect Lugia that little bit more, with Giacomo, 4 Crushing Hammer, 3 Temple of Sinnoh, We are still playing the second copy of the Rotom, and I am still going for Hero's Cape here, but it is certainly much more debatable, and I would suggest testing the secret box in the deck list as well. At the end of the day, I don't think a build like this 2-0s a Lugia, so you may think that ties are losses anyway at the World Championships, and that it's not worth committing these spaces, so it's definitely a debate up for you if you feel like it's worthwhile nicking a tie against a Lugia, or just accepting that it's an 0-2 matchup and you just want to face something else in the next round. Let's go into more details about these matchups then, and really it comes down to what counts your opponent has. When we're trying to think about how we can block our opponent from attacking altogether, there's of course a number of Pokemon in the Regidrago deck which can't attack, so you can certainly grab some sort of Pokemon and stick them in the active either with Erica or with those accompanying flutes, so trying to get things like Squawkabilly trapped and such is one of your best situations here. Typically Regidrago is playing one switch and one copy of Prime Catcher, but they do have that Legacy Star ability as well that can recover cards from the discard pile as well, and bear in mind they have Cancelling Clone, and it does feel like it's going to be a combination of you trying to use block, also trying to weave in cards like Mimikyu in this matchup. So you're kind of trying to attack them on two fronts, and that's really because the Regidrago can discard different cards from their researchers and from their Legacy Star almost like by mistake, and that means that you can try and target one side or the other based on what's discarded from them. Also be aware that if they are playing Mew EX and they have board space for it, be even more cautious with your Mimikyu usage, because genome hacking can actually copy this attack, and they play Energy Switch as well, so a Mew could in theory come out of nowhere to place 7 counters on your Mimikyu, so you typically do want to have a Bravery Charm on here, or even that Mist Energy could come in clutch once again. The good news is that all of these critical cards are items, so trying to spam your Eerie and Misfortune Sisters aggressively as you sort of submit these prize cards with Mimikyu and with Snorlax is going to be the go-to option here. And you basically ignore Cornerstone, Ogerpon unless you've already seen them use their V-Star power, a Cancelling Clone's gone, and their board is full, and they can't even attack with a basic Regidrago V. The Gardevoir EX matchup has got a lot better in recent times with the Handheld Fan and Crushing Hammers weaving their way into the deck list, but there is still a lot that you have to keep in check here, as oftentimes the Gardevoir is going to prioritize getting 4 Rolts into play, as well as a combination of Klefki and Fluttermane to fill their board entirely, trying to render your Erica and Flutes useless. Also be aware that Gardevoir is sort of between 1 and 2 Churro. I would expect more lists to play 1 copy than 2, which is good news for you. Even though Rolts can now Teleportation Burst out of the active position, and they will start running you quite low on Counter Catcher and Boss's orders, because you have that Handheld Fan to help out, I do think it can still be worth trying to trap those Rolts. Also, when your opponent is attacking with their Gardevoir EX, it is still really handy to weave in your Mimikyu, especially if it is Hero's Cape or Bravery Charmed. It's very rare that Gardevoir will fit a Lost Vacuum in the list. You do force that Gardevoir to retreat and go into something like a Fluttermane, which doesn't deal enough damage to get through the Mimikyu, which can open up more penny plays for you, which is really helpful. The good thing about your opponent retreating is that even though they have the sort of infinite resource of Psychic coming back onto certain Pokemon, it's not actually infinite, because they are going to be self-damaging, so trying to spam your Crushing Hammers on something like Fluttermane, which has already received 6 damage counters on it, could actually be a real headache for them, as you make them start spending manual attachments as well as their Psychic Embraces, which is actually going to be quite a close run thing, because they're already going to have energy scattered around multiple Rolts and such. I would be cautious of Handheld Fan moving energy onto Rolts, because of course it can slow evolve back up to Curlier and a second copy of Gardevoir EX, and I also wouldn't put all energy onto one target, because I want to play around Churro as best as possible. There's no doubt that this matchup is predominantly won by Snorlax at the helm. Onto the Charizard matchup then, and this one did get a little trickier with the inclusion of Dusknoir. Like I said, the opponent can Cursed Blast to force us to take prize cards, which is annoying for a handful of reasons. It makes us more vulnerable to Iono. Also might mean that we can't Counter Catcher on specific turns of the game, which might be a little bit annoying. And bear in mind that most Charizard builds are playing at least Professor Churro's Scenario, also Collapse Stadium, and sometimes even the Kieran Supporter as well, to get around the blocking side of our deck. The other big issue, of course, with Dusknoir is that it can KO our Mimikyu, and that's why there's a 2 count of the Cornerstone Ogerpon in some of these lists that I've shown, because that's going to be the real headache for the Charizard players. I'm absolutely terrified if Charizard is playing a combination of Gouging Fire and Dusknoir, but most lists don't have the space for that combination, so you should be okay leading the way with Cornerstone and seeing how it goes. As you start rooting out those super odds and whatnot, that's when you can also look to weave in a block strategy on some of their attacking Pokemon. Onto the Lugia matchup, like I said, a really awkward one. Keep an eye on their Jet Energies, also keep an eye on their Stadium counts. The 2 count of Jamming Tower would be the absolute worst thing possible for you, because that can force pressure on your Handheld Fans. and your hit point buffing tools. Like I said, this one's going to be better or worse depending on whether you are actually playing the tech inclusions. If you're not, you're really hoping to have high variance with your crushing hammers and that they've had to do like research on a number of energy cards in the opening stages. If you are playing Giacomo Temple, these are of course going to be the go-to cards to dig towards. Raging Bolt should be one of our better matchups. They can fill their board with Pokemon which can attack, but typically their answers to Mimikyu aren't that great. Sandy Shocks can attack into it for 1 energy. As soon as they attack the Mimikyu with Sandy Shocks, we can pivot our strategy to Snorlax and cause them a huge headache. Mew-EX would kind of be their other alternate attacker in that matchup. And again, it's only placing 7 counters, so if you have the Miss Energy and hit point buffing tools, you should be fine with your Mimikyu. Using that Mimikyu to leverage time to just weave in your Snorlax as and when you need to, and to just spam those area Misfortune Sisters is still going to be the way to go here. The Lost Zone box matchup also isn't all that shabby. They do play a ton of switching outs, but you can very aggressively target them with Eerie, with Misfortune Sisters as well. And as we know, they also have to Lost Zone stuff and spend a lot of these switching cards in the opening stages with their com phase just generally, and there'll be no shortage of Pokemon for us to bring back into the active position. Do be aware that Roaring Moon EX could be a headache Pokemon. It has high damage output, no ability on it, and the Frenzied Gouging can also get around Mimikyu if you don't have Mist Energy. At the same time, that can self-KO and again unlock cards like Roxanne for them to give you a big hand disruption in the mid to late game. Onto the Dragapult matchup. This one is also awkward because Dragapult itself can attack into the Cornerstone Mask and Dusknoir can get around the Mimikyu quite effectively. The main hope here is that they just don't have enough switching cards for you. Trying to weave in your handheld fans when they are attacking your Snorlax early can also target their low count of energy in the deck list. The good news very often is that they don't play many switching cards. I think Unchurro's scenario is pretty much what I expect. If there's more than that, I'd be quite surprised. The Chien-Pao matchup is one of our better ones. They typically only play one switch out, which is Prime Catcher, which makes Snorlax absolutely insane. Some lists in the worst case scenario will play Cancelling Clone and Silene, but that's really fallen out of favor as of late. I think that's the only way that we can have much trouble in this matchup. Typically it's going to be one of your bread and butter ones. There are even going to be board states where Cornerstone Ogerpon can take the wheel if you fill their board with Flutes and Erica. The Miraidon matchup also isn't all that terrifying. They're typically playing a few more outs than the Chien-Pao though. They often have Prime Catcher and maybe a couple switch card in their deck list as well as Boss's Orders. So they are going to be sort of a pace setting archetype, and we have to be aware that Iron Hands can be a threat if they are going to maybe set up some damage. They're often playing Zapdos, which can actually be an attacking threat. And once again, the Mew-EX can be their sort of alternate attacker to get around Mimikyu, as long as you don't have Mist Energy. I think this matchup more so comes down to how they want to tandem unit. Are they going to try and force Iron Hands into play so they have a non-ability attacker? Are they going to allow space for Zapdos so it can attack through Mimikyu? And how they allocate their energy is going to be really important here, because all their attackers are really expensive to attack with, and as soon as they bench them, they can always fall prey to a boss or a counter catcher. So either they leave the board space open and fall prey to Flute and Erica, or they fill the board and fall prey to boss and counter catcher before they've had the chance to use their electric generators. Typically, either with Mimikyu or with the Snorlax, we should be able to find avenues to again target the opponent's hand with our supporter cards. Onto the closing thoughts then. Half the battle with Snorlax, like I said, is knowing what you're trying to target and how your opponent is going to try and beat you. Based on what resources are in the sort of most common builds, will sort of dictate which supporter card you want to prioritize, whether it's a matchup where you have to preemptively use your Eerie and Misfortune Sisters, or if those are a lower priority compared to just penny spamming low damage that your opponent is poking you with. Playing Snorlax to the World Championships and a deck like this, which just has such polarizing matchups as we saw earlier, really does leave your fate to which decks you face on the day. You can do your best in terms of metagaming, and you're still just trying to cross your fingers that you hit the right string of matchups. There's no doubt that Snorlax can go far in tournaments. We've seen it many times this season, but typically they would have been the players that simply dodged the worst matchups. One other thing to note about Snorlax, even though it's had incredible online data, a lot of these tournaments are open deck list, and a Snorlax player knows exactly what to play around and can have 100% confidence that what they're doing is right, and they know exactly when your opponent's out of stuff. Whereas in closed deck list situations, your opponent can catch you out with counts you don't expect, with tech inclusions, or you even have to take certain lines to respect the idea of them having extra copies within their deck, and it might make your plays just more awkward and more taxing. My advice for testing Snorlax would be testing against the lists that have these sort of higher number of counts of answers within their deck. Even though your win rate will be lower, it gives you those opportunities to see where you can play the safest lines, so that when you're in these closed deck list situations, you can play into extra eventualities of the opponent even having the doomsday scenario of additional techs. What do you guys think about Snorlax? Do you think it's going to be a top contender for the World Championships? Do you think that the tournament structure puts players off this deck? Or do you think the matchup spread is still so appealing that it's going to perform quite well? I'll hear your thoughts down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.